The Maya by Dr. Michael David Coe. Chapter 10. The Enduring Maya. The 7.5 million or so Maya alive in the world today are survivors. They have endured repeated cycles of conquest that continue unabated even today. What have kept the Maya people culturally and even physically viable are their hold on the land and that land on them, a devotion to their community, and an all-pervading and meaningful belief system. It is small wonder that their oppressors have concentrated on these three areas in incessant attempts to destroy them as a people, and to exploit them as a politically helpless labor force. As the novelist and anthropologist Oliver Lafarge put it over half a century ago, from the conquest until recently there has been a steady drive, with some reversals, to destroy the Indian ownership of large blocks of land, which forms the physical and economic base of tribal solidarity and of freedom from the necessity to work for non-Indians. Lafarge, largely drawing on Guatemalan data, saw 5 broad stages in the history of the Maya since the initial invasion of their lands by the Spaniards. The first is the conquest period, from 1524 until the end of the 16th century. This was a violent era, shattering Indian cultural structures, although some native polities, particularly in the Peten, were not subdued until the close of the following century. The next stage was the colonial Indian, which lasted until 1724, at which time the Spanish crown abolished the encomienda system, an oppressive institution which had given Spanish land barons total right to Indian forced labor in return for the supposed conversion of the natives to the Christian religion. It was a time when Spanish and Christian elements were absorbed wholesale into the fabric of Maya life and somewhat altered to fit the pattern of native culture. Many Maya traits were destroyed or mutilated, while others were greatly changed. During the transition period, lasting until the colonies broke away from Spain about 1820, life became more tolerable for the Maya as Spanish control slowly relaxed and suppressed Maya cultural traits re-emerged. It was during this time that traditional Maya patterns took on the form that they retain today. Recent Indian one was ushered in by the independence of Mexico and Guatemala and persisted until the 1870s or 1880s, while Lafarge saw this as an era of smooth integration between Spanish and Maya elements with relative tranquility. This is true only for the Guatemalan highlands under the country's pro-Indian conservative government. A different story could be told in Chiapas with major Indian revolts, and in Yucatan with the caste wars in which the Maya came close to crushing their white overlords. From 1880 until today, we are in recent Indian II, marked by a tide of intervention of Indian life, and with concerted efforts by governments to force the Maya to become laborers on cash crop plantations as part of the world market system. Travelers to Guatemala City may drive along the Avenida de la Reforma, but they surely will not know what the reform was. The abolition by President Rufino Barrios of Indian communal lands and the imposition of a system to supply forced labor from the Maya highlands to the newly established coffee fincas of the Pacific Piedmont zone. Bitter revolts against this injustice took place, but they were put down by the liberal government of Barrios with a ferocity that foreshadowed more modern developments. Such imposed seasonal migrations were absent in the Yucatan Peninsula, but on the great Xena Canton plantations, which covered much of the north, rock-bottom wages and debt peonage were the rule. This last period was marked by the emergence of a new cross to be borne by the Maya, the invasion of their lands, villages, and towns by a class of Ladinos, Hispanic or Hispanicized or Hispanicized citizens who occupied all the lucrative and politically powerful positions in largely Maya territories. They were the shopkeepers, the labor majordomos, the school teachers, the judiciary, the Catholic priests. They spoke Spanish rather than the Indian dialects, as the Maya languages were pejoratively thought of. They dressed in Western clothes, and they generally held themselves to be superior to the native peoples. It is a situation that persists. The New Spanish Order. To understand the processes of conflict, accommodation, and integration that have gone on among the Mayas since the conquest, it is necessary to understand what the Spaniards introduced. First and foremost were epidemic diseases previously unknown in the New World, such as smallpox, influenza, and measles. It is generally agreed among scholars that these produced a holocaust unparalleled in the world's history. Within a century, 90% of the native population have been killed off, including that of the Maya area. Smallpox, in fact, had reached the Guatemalan highlands even before the arrival of Pedro de Alvarado, and it is a wonder that the weakened Maya put up the defense that they did. Over the next 2 centuries, then, the Spaniards were able to impose their own cultural pattern on regions that had been devastated by disease. By order of church and crown, these scattered populations were reduced, that is, concentrated into villages and towns on the Spanish pattern where they could be better controlled and converted. These new settlements were laid out in the grid plan with rectilinear streets, a central plaza, and a church, a settlement type still to be seen throughout the Maya area. Along with the church, the seat of religious power, there was usually a building housing the ayuntamiento, the civil government run by or under the thumb of Spaniards or Ladinos, and later on, a Ladino-run store. Catholicism brought its priests, its rituals, and its saints, and was usually the principal agent of acculturation. One of its most successful institutions was the cofradia, the confraternity or brotherhood, adopted enthusiastically throughout the highlands, each dedicated to the care and honor of a particular saint. There are 12 of these brotherhoods, for instance, among the Ixil of the Nebach region, and they play a crucial role in the ritual life of these people. The Christian sacrament of baptism introduced another element into native social life, mainly that of the compadrazgo or co-godparenthood, which formalizes bonds of friendship between adult Maya. There was, of course, a great deal of syncretism between Spanish and Maya religious institutions and beliefs, since in many respects they were so similar. Both burned incense during rituals, both had images which they worshipped, both had priests, and both conducted elaborate pilgrimages set by their respective calendars. Both, as Nikolai Gruby reminds us, had a hero god who died and was resurrected. For the Spaniards, this was Jesus Christ, and for the Maya, the maize god. Thus, when the Tzotzil Maya of Xena Canton made pilgrimages to crosses set up on holy mountains, it is really irrelevant to ask if this is a Maya or a Spanish custom. To the Tzotzil, both cross and ancestral mountain are a unity. But the European invaders brought with them more than their civil and religious order. They imposed an economic order as well. Iron and steel tools replaced chipped or ground stone ones, and the Maya took readily to the Spaniards axes, machetes, and billhooks, which in the lowlands enabled them to cope with the forest as they never had before. Cattle, pigs, and chickens began to replace game as the main source of meat in the diet, although the Maya never took to the heavy use of lard and oil, which was such a prominent feature of the Spanish cuisine. The invaders brought in citrus trees, watermelons, and other welcome crops, but the sugarcane and coffee, the latter largely supplanting the native cacao, introduced as cash crops, were a mixed blessing as they led to the plantations that put economic shackles on the Maya. Perhaps the most destructive of these introduced elements was distilled alcohol. The Maya had always used alcohol in their rituals, chicha or maize beer in the highlands, and chich, pulque, and balche, a flavored mead, in the lowlands, but they were unprepared for the power of the Spaniards' aguardiente, and many a despondent Maya sought relief for oblivion in strong drink, a habit encouraged by the Ladino majordomos and store owners. On the plus side, though, was the Roman alphabet, initially used by the earlier missionaries to write down sermons and the like in the native languages. It was not long before educated Maya were using it to transcribe their own ritual and historical texts, which had previously existed in hieroglyphic form, an activity which was probably conducted in secret. To this we owe the preservation of the great Quiche epic, the Popol Vuh, and the Yucatec Maya books of Ek Balam. In Yucatan, there has always been a strong tradition of native literacy, still kept by men who occupied the office of the atzib or scribe. It was probably such specialists who produced the large body of surviving letters in Yucatec exchanged between leaders of the caste wars of the 1840s and 1850s. In all of this, the various Maya groups have clearly assimilated and altered many disparate foreign and even threatening elements to fit their own cultural patterns inherited from the pre-conquest era. Take the marimba, a percussion instrument ultimately of African origin, but introduced to Guatemala in colonial times. Today it appears as a typically Maya instrument in native performances, both religious and secular. So assimilated is it that many tourists believe that it must be pre-Columbian. The Highland Maya, yesterday and today. Anthropologists and other social scientists agree that about 60% of Guatemala's population of 10 million is Maya. Most of these live in the central and western highlands of the country, the eastern part having been subject to heavy Spanish migration and consequent Ladinoization over these centuries. Another million Maya, mainly Tzotzil and Tzetal, occupy the adjacent Chiapas highlands. All of these populations are rapidly growing and expanding, in spite of poverty and malnutrition, and in spite of Guatemala's recent history of terror. The highland Maya economy is both a part of and separate from the economies of the modern nation-states of Mexico and Guatemala. Most Maya households engage in corn farming, and many produce crafts for local consumption or for sale in Indian-run markets. But in many areas, the men must travel long distances to work in the lowlands for part of the year on coffee fincas, cotton plantations, and the like. One of the most striking features of the Maya lands in Guatemala, apart from the magnificent landscape, is the vast network of markets and trade routes linking them, producing, as one anthropologist called it, a kind of penny capitalism. These markets can sometimes be spectacular, like the ones at Solola and Santiago Atitlan, near Lake Atitlan, with their row upon row of colorfully garbed Maya women selling produce of all kinds. It is typical of the Maya highlands that each village will have its own distinctive style of dress. The skirts of the women are usually machine-made, ikat wraparounds, but their embroidered cotton blouses or huipiles mark them as members of a particular community. Recent studies made by Walter Chip Morris have shown that the designs in them are not merely decorative, but rather illustrate a complex iconographic system based on native and sometimes Christian cosmology. The men, in contrast, wear clothing more or less based on Spanish modes of dress, but even this has been transformed into something distinctive to the community. Solola men, for example, wear short black and white jackets with frogging, but on the back of each is a great emblematic bat, while the Tzotzil men of Xena Canton are clad with broad-brimmed, bee-ribboned straw hats, ponchos, and high-backed sandals, recalling those of the classic Maya. The old Maya calendar round has survived to an extraordinary degree in the highlands. Among peoples like the Ixil and the Quiche, the 260-day count is an integral part not only of native ritual but of their everyday life, as it was among their distant ancestors. Wherever it is found, there are shaman priests or day keepers whose job it is to keep track of the round of days and to conduct rituals for individuals and the whole community in accord with its dictates. The most dramatic of these is the Great Eight Monkey or Washakib Bats ceremony, held in the Quiche community of Momostenango every 260 days. On the day of that name, tens of thousands of Indians gather at dawn at altars formed of mounds of broken pottery. There, over 200 shamans act as intermediaries between individual petitioners and the supreme deity Dios Mundo, God World. Prayers are made for forgiveness for past sins, and requests that some boon be granted, while each individual adds a potsherd to the pile. An important function of all highland shamans is divination. This is sometimes done through the mechanism of the 260-day count, along with the casting of certain red seeds or maize kernels, a practice deeply rooted in the pre-Spanish past. The Tzotzil Maya of Xena Canton. The resilience of the contemporary highland Maya when left in relative peace to work out their own destinies in a changing world is well exemplified by the Tzotzil of Xena Canton, a community that was intensively studied over a period of years by a Harvard project director by Evan Vogt. The approximately 12,000 Xenacantecos live in a landscape of rugged mountains. Over 1,000 occupy the ceremonial center within a densely occupied valley, while the rest are scattered in outlying hamlets. The Xenacanteco world is conceived of as a large quincush with four corners and a navel of the earth in the middle, actually a low, rounded mound in the ceremonial center. This all rests on the shoulders of the Vajjakmen, the four-corner gods. When one of these shifts his burden, there is an earthquake. The sky above is the domain of the sun, moon, and stars. While the sun, our Holy Father, is associated in Xenacanteco cosmology with God the Father or Jesus Christ, the moon is thought to be one with the Virgin Mary. Mountains and hills located near settlements are the homes of ancestral deities, fathers and mothers. These supernaturals are pictured as elderly Xenacantecos living internally in their mountain abodes and are referred to constantly in prayers and rituals conducted in their honor. They are sustained by offerings of black chickens, candles, incense, and liquor. Many Mayanists, incidentally, are convinced that these holy ancestral mountains are directly analogous to the temple pyramids of the classic Maya cities, which celebrated the cult of the dead and presumably deified royal ancestors. Almost of equal weight in Xenacanteco religious life is the Earth Lord, thought of as a fat, greedy Landino who dwells in caves, limestone sinks, and waterholes. He owns all the waterholes and controls and produces lightning and rain. The most sacred objects in Xena Canton are the wood or plaster images of the saints. They have their own legends and associated beliefs, not always the same as those in the official hagiographies, and most are kept in 3 churches in the center. The Xenacanteco people, on their lowest level of social organization, live in patrilocal extended families, which in turn are grouped into local patrilineages or SNA. Each SNA maintains a series of cross shrines on nearby mountains for communicating with the ancestral deities, and in caves for communicating with the Earth Lord. 2 to over a dozen patrilineages form a waterhole group. Waterholes are highly sacred, and in turn keep up their own series of cross shrines. A particular hamlet will be made up of several waterhole groups. It will be remembered that the Spaniards imposed a civil hierarchy on each Maya group, and this persists in the ceremonial center of Xena Canton, with strictly ranked officials who are elected to 3-year terms. But the most important hierarchy, as can be seen in native communities throughout the New World, is religious. Some of the people with religious power are shamans or seers, of whom there are over 250, almost all adult males. Of overwhelming significance to the community is the system of ranked religious offices, which functions on the cargo principle, in which each office is conceptualized as bearing a burden, or cargo in Spanish. Within this hierarchy, which fulfills the function of the confraternities found elsewhere, there are 61 positions grouped into 4 levels of seniority. All cargo holders must reside in the center for the duration of the office, and as they rise through the ranks, their expenses grow increasingly exorbitant. After occupying the most senior rank, a Xenacanteco can expect to retire as a poor but highly honored individual. This is a burden indeed. Xenacanteco rituals require formalized eating and drinking, and often large processions to sacred places. The abiding concern with rank shows up in how individuals are placed in these activities. There are many rituals for the curing and well-being of individuals. These often involve a person's innate soul or chulel, as well as his or her animal counterpart. Every Xenancanteco has such an alter ego, all of which live together in corrals within a 9,200 feet high extinct volcano. The chulel is clearly cognate with the way of the classic Maya. There are waterhole and lineage rituals, as well as frequent ceremonies conducted in the ceremonial center by cargo holders. But the greatest of all are the end-of-the-year/New Year cargo rites, which reach their culmination in the latter half of January in celebrations held in honor of Saint Sebastian. Like the myths which surround this Roman saint, themselves the results of 4 centuries of syncretism, these dramatic ceremonies show a heady mixture of Christian and Maya pagan elements. Much of the action is pure theater, with actors ritually impersonating monkeys, animals left over from a previous creation, jaguars, black men, and Spanish men and women. The entire religious drama is clearly directed towards renewal of the universe and of the community, and ends with the transfer of the sacred objects of office to a new set of cargo holders. As Professor Vogt has said of these Xenacantecan Maya, they are a shrewd people and have not retreated from the encroachment of Ladino civilization. What is most valued and most vital to the culture has been reinforced, for the ritual life is, if anything, more intensified and elaborated than ever before. The Yucatec Maya. The Spanish conquest of Yucatan was a protracted and by no means completely successful process, and it ended with Spanish control being confined to the northern third of the peninsula, along with portions of the west and east coasts. The foreign overlords lived in villas with European administrative machinery and the usual grid plan. Around and between them were hundreds of Maya communities that were forced to pay a comienda tribute and more or less forced labor, as well as to give up their idolatry. The ethno-historian Grant Jones has documented that to the south and east lay a huge area inhabited by tens of thousands of Maya who had refused to submit to this oppression. This included most of the Peten and Belize, the east coast of the peninsula, and the region to the south of Campeche. At the heart of these defiant lands was Itza, or Tayasal, which, as we have seen in Chapter 7, only surrendered to Spanish arms in 1697. Various attempts to colonize the region by the Spaniards failed time and time again, one reason being, as Professor Jones has found, that vast numbers of Yucatec Maya were arriving from the north, where they had fled the terrible encomienda system. As a result, the eastern part of the peninsula, including most of what later became the Mexican territory of Quintana Roo, remained a bastion of Maya independence until very recent times. The War of the Castes. As in the highlands, the achievement of independence by the modern nation-states that controlled the Maya meant not a betterment of conditions for the latter, but worsening. The cruelty and misery of the sisal plantations and cattle ranches of Yucatan were aptly documented in the books of John Lloyd Stephens, who saw them at first hand. The storm that became known to rich Yucatecan whites as the War of the Castes broke out in 1847. Not long after Stephens' visit, when almost all the Maya of the peninsula took up arms against the hated whites. Eventually, the government troops held only Merida, some towns along the coast, and the main road leading from Campeche. The conquest had been reversed. This denouement of this story is well known. When the time came for the Indians to plant corn in their milpas, the native army disintegrated. Nonetheless, in 1850, a new element was introduced into the conflict. This took place in Chan Santa Cruz, a native village in central Quintana Roo, where a miraculous talking cross began to prophesy a holy war against the whites, bolstered by arms and other military equipment received from the British in Belize. The Maya of the region, now formed into quasi-military companies and inspired by messianic zeal, once more battled the armies of the oppressors. Fighting was not to end until 1901, when federal forces under General Ignacio Bravo took Chan Santa Cruz, but Mexican government control gradually faded away during the ensuing decades. Talking crosses proliferated, and the Maya of Quintana Roo went their own way. I saw a talking cross inside the Castillo at Tulum as late as 1948. Only the frantic development of tourism over the last 25 years has managed to spell the doom of Maya culture in this part of the peninsula. The Maya of Chancom, located in just about the center of the Yucatan Peninsula, during the 1930s when it was the focus of study by the anthropologist Robert Redfield and Alfonso Villarrojas, Chancom was the typical Yucatec Maya village. It has since been quote-unquote modernized considerably, but settlements like Chancom, as it then was, can yet be found throughout the peninsula. With its houses of whitewashed walls and thatched roofs, and its women in spotlessly white huipiles edged with colorful embroidery, it offered a picture of rural tranquility belied by the turbulent history of victors and vanquished in the Maya lowlands. Like their counterparts in Xena Canton, most of the Chancom Maya were and are maize farmers, but here they practice lowland slash-and-burn, shifting cultivation rather than the fixed-field systems of the highlands. There is the usual Spanish-style municipal government, but nothing like the religious hierarchy that is so striking among people like the Tzotzil. Two types of religious specialists practice here, and in another traditional Yucatec Maya settlements. One is the maestro cantor, or choir master, a layman who nevertheless knows the Catholic prayers that may be used in Christian rituals like baptism, weddings, and funerals. The other is the seemingly imbued with far greater spiritual and perhaps real power. This is the H-man, he who does or understands things. That is, the shaman. H-manob are found all over the peninsula, even in large cities like Merida, but they are an integral part of the agricultural rituals so vital to rural life. Even though the traditional Maya 260-day calendar has disappeared in Yucatan, these specialists still play an important role in divination and prophecy, using their crystals to scry the future. The supernatural world is ever present in Chancom and in the outlying fields and forests. At the four entrances to the village are 4 pairs of crosses and 4 Balam jaguar spirits, watching to keep evil away from the householders. The benevolent Yefir Blamob also act as guardians of the cornfields. There are many Cha'akob, rain gods, descended from the classic and post-classic deity Cha'ak, visualized as old men on horseback, led by Saint Michael Archangel. Other supernaturals invoked in agricultural rites are deities of the forest in which the farmer must clear his plot, gods of the bees, and guardians of deer and cattle. Evil winds loose in the world can attack one and cause sickness. Also to be avoided are the Alushob, leprechaun-like dwarves with large hats who bring misfortune. Judging from the intensity of farming rituals in Yucatan, anxieties centered on subsistence must be far higher than in the highlands. As we have seen in Chapter 1, the peninsula has generally thin soils, and rainfall is far more sparse than in the south. Underlying these ceremonies performed in the milpas of Chancom farmers is the idea that what man wins from nature, he takes from the gods. The nature gods must be asked for favors, and they must be repaid through prayers and offerings, including sacred foods and the first fruits of the harvest. These foods are those not consumed in ordinary life: stacks of bean-smeared tortillas cooked in the pieb or pit, balche mead, saka, sacred maize gruel, broth made from fowls and sacrificed animals. About every 4th year, an individual farmer will sponsor an uanliko, dinner of the milpa, rite, conducted by a H-man at a rustic altar set with these holy foods and drink. The largest and most dramatic of the Yucatec Maya agricultural ceremonies is the Cha'acha'ak. Its purpose is to bring rain during times of drought, and thus involves the entire community. The participants are only men, who withdraw for several days to the place on the village's outskirts, where the Cha'acha'ak is to be held. The rite begins after the H-man has consulted his zastun or crystal. The altar is covered with fowl, venison, and the sacred breadstuffs and drink, all set out in predetermined order. Under the altar and tied to its legs are 4 boys who croak like the woe frogs, which are harbingers of rain in the Maya lowlands. Off to one side is an older man, chosen to impersonate the Kunku Cha'ak, the chief of the rain gods, including holding in one hand the calabash from which he unleashes rain on the cornfields, and in the other a wooden knife symbolizing the lightning that accompanies downpours. The Maya H-Manob have other duties as well, most importantly to cure sickness, which the people of Chancom generally hold to come from evil winds and the evil eye. For this, curing rituals are held, which include the usual offerings to the gods. As with their highland counterparts, these shamans also engage in divination, either by using their magic crystals or by separating out cast maize kernels by groups of 4, the outcome depending upon whether the number of piles is odd or even, or the remainder odd or even. Witchcraft is an omnipresent danger. The witch takes the form of animal alter ego or Y, see Chapter 9. It may be male or female. The witch visits sleeping individuals like the incubus of European folklore, and through illicit sex, saps that person's strength. The La Canton. Visitors to the site of Palenque may encounter near the entrance 2 or 3 Maya men with long hair and wearing long white robes, selling bows and arrows, especially made for the tourist trade. These are La Canton, members of a stubbornly independent tribal group that some say number about 250 and others place at about 500, a discrepancy that may arise from the fact that some choose to live as Ladinos for part of the year. The Lacandan inhabit 3 small villages in what was once a vast rainforest in eastern Chiapas. Historically, they almost certainly originated as one of the Yucatec-speaking refugee groups who chose to flee to the jungle fastness at the base of the peninsula rather than submit to Spanish rule. While most Lacandan have been converted to fundamentalist Christianity, some have remained fiercely conservative, preserving many elements of the old Maya religion. These latter still making pilgrimages to the ruined temples of Yaxchilan, invoking the gods with their incense-filled pottery censers. At one time, they hunted and farmed in an unbroken, hide-canopied forest. This was set aside for them in the 1970s by presidential decree, and an edict which was soon abrogated, releasing lumber companies to sack its valuable timber. The lumber trucks were followed by an army of landless peasants, largely impoverished Setal Maya from the highlands, who cut down what remained of the jungle. The final stage in the death of the Lacandan forest has been the conversions of the peasant holdings to great cattle fincas, supplying beef to feed Americans' hunger for hamburgers. Uprising in Chiapas. Most of the land and all of the political life in the state of Chiapas has been in the hands of Ladino ranch owners and merchants for centuries. Closely allied with Mexico's ruling political party, the PRI, they have managed to keep the Maya majority in their state disenfranchised and land poor. The signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, by Mexico and the United States threatened to further worsen the economic situation of the indigenous people in southeastern Mexico, but the Mayas seemed powerless. Then, on January 1st, 1994, the Zapatista National Liberation Army, or EZLN, a guerrilla force of Tzotzil and Tzeltal, led by a former university student calling himself Subcomandante Marcos, stormed San Cristobal Las Casas, one of the major centers of Ladino power in the state. This was an unprecedented event in the history of Mexico, where the indigenous peoples have generally been mute and defenseless bystanders in whatever internal conflicts the country has gone through. In spite of the presence of tens of thousands of army troops brought in to control the situation, the Zapatistas have managed to maintain their armed resistance, and through a sophisticated use of the media, including the internet, they have won considerable sympathy for their cause from the rest of Mexico and the outside world. Their demands include economic, political, and cultural rights not only for the Maya of Chiapas, but also for all of Mexico's indigenous peoples. Whether the present PNA government or the PRI opposition, which has always actively pursued a policy of complete assimilation for Mexico's native Indians, will ever accede to these demands remains to be seen. The Great Terror. The greatest and bloodiest episode in the cycles of conquest that have befallen the Maya since the arrival of the Spaniards began on May 29, 1978, in the Quechua-speaking town of Panzos, in the department of Alta Verapaz, Guatemala. There, a unit of the Guatemalan army opened fire on a group of Indians peacefully protesting the government's refusal to award them land titles. Over 100 men, women, and children were immediately killed. Worse yet for the Highland Maya, a second element had entered the picture. The guerrilla army of the poor, later recognized as the Guatemalan National Revolutionary Unity, or URNG, which had chosen to base its anti-government operations in the western part of the highlands. Consisting largely of Marxist Ladinos, the guerrillas looked upon traditional Maya culture as an obstacle to the proletarian revolution which they intended to bring about. Nevertheless, the Indian villagers had little choice but to give them support in the way of food and shelter. Revolution by the Guatemalan government, its army, and its police came swiftly. Under a series of military regimes, some actively supported by the Reagan administration, the official security forces and governmental death squads unleashed a reign of terror against the Maya that was almost unprecedented in its ferocity. It is estimated by anthropologists like George Lovell of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, that over 1 million Maya were displaced. According to a report by the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, approximately 150,000 people were killed, and an additional 40,000 quote-unquote disappeared, almost all of these being Maya. By the end of the terrible decade of the 1980s, 35,000 Indian refugees were living in camps in Mexico, and thousands had fled to the United States. This was indeed ethnocide, if not genocide on a grand scale. Uprooted communities were forced into model villages, a move recommended by the American military advisors, where able-bodied men were required to perform service in civil patrols. For hundreds of thousands of Quiche, Ixil, Mam, and other Maya, the traditional ties with the land had finally been shattered, or so the army leaders thought. As these immense disruptions took place, fundamentalist Christian missionaries from the United States, with government support, 2 recent presidents have been evangelical Protestants, began to make vast numbers of converts among Guatemala's Maya. With whole villages undergoing mass baptism, the effect on the traditional structure of Maya life, the confraternities and cargo system, for instance, may well be imagined. The Maya future. Will the Maya survive? They have been under attack from every side, from the army and death squads in Guatemala, from mass tourism and the destruction of the tropical forest in Mexico, from Ladino encroachments on their lands everywhere. These almost intolerable pressures have resulted in vast dislocations and migrations throughout the Maya area. But there are signs of hope for them. In Guatemala, many Maya intellectuals have realized that, to survive, various Maya linguistic groups, heretofore separate, must come together to save their language and culture. And many more Maya now know that they can stand up to terror by speaking out. Rigoberta Menchú, a Quiché Maya woman who lost most of her family to the death squads, did so, for which she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 1992. A turning point in the fortunes of the Maya may now have been reached in Guatemala. In December 1995, with a new and less anti-Maya government in power and a Democratic president in the White House, the regime signed a series of peace accords with the main guerrilla group, the URNG. Among the provisions negotiated under United Nations auspices were an accountability for all the human rights violations perpetrated by the armed forces over the years, a resettlement of an estimated 1 million displaced persons, most of them, of course, Maya, and an affirmation of the cultural identity and rights of the indigenous Maya population. Incredibly, since the Accords, Guatemala has become a truly multicultural nation on the South African model. Spearheading a virtual Maya renaissance is the Academia de las Lenguas Mayas, established as long ago as 1984, which realized that given the multiplicity of Mayan tongues spoken in the Republic, there would have to be a standardized Mayan orthography, the one adopted in this book. As a result of their efforts, there is now bilingual instruction in several hundred Guatemalan schools and active teaching of local languages. A government agency has been set up to deal with the rights of the indigenous majority, particularly regarding education and community land ownership. Inevitably, the United Maya will push for their own political party, something unheard of in the rest of the Americas, where native peoples remain completely marginalized. Of course, these developments have already led to opposition in the Ladino-controlled Congress, where these accords must be implemented, and in the Ladino-controlled press, with sarcastic articles suggesting that the country be named Guatemala. But the participation of millions of Maya in decisions about their own future seems irreversible. There is now a pan-Maya movement in eastern Mesoamerica, and a profound sense among these people of their glorious past. It is in a way ironic that Guatemala, with its past record of total suppression, should now be moving in the direction that it is, and that Mexico, superficially loyal to the ideas of the 1911 revolution, and happy to exploit for touristic purposes the wonders of the ruined Maya cities, should be trampling the rights of the people who built them. The Yucatec Maya of the Talking Cross villages in Quintana Roo prophesy a coming great war, an Armageddon when, as they told Paul Sullivan, a new king will awaken in Chichen Itza, along with thousands of petrified beings from a past creation, and a petrified feathered serpent will come to life and inflict havoc on the creatures of this creation. Messianic predictions like this will surely crop up again and again as pressures on the Maya intensify. Yet the Maya are actually increasing, not dwindling in numbers, and a heightened awareness that they are all one people with a glorious past, and an adaptability to future change may help them survive for centuries into the future. This concludes Chapter 10.